November 13th, 1943. The air hung heavy with moisture as tropical rain dripped from broad jungle leaves onto the muddy ground of Bougainville Island. Sergeant Maxwell Hawkins felt sweat trickling down his neck as he remained completely still, his finger resting alongside the trigger guard of his M1 Garand rifle. He and 24 other Marines from Echo Company had been hiding in these positions for nearly 6 hours now, camouflaged with mud, leaves, and jungle debris. "Remember, not a sound until you see the signal," Lieutenant Raymond Gunderson had whispered at dawn as they'd established their positions flanking the narrow jungle path. "Let them get deep into the kill zone." Hawkins scanned the dense vegetation ahead where the Numa Trail emerged from a bend. Intelligence reports had indicated Japanese forces would be moving through this area, attempting to dislodge the American beachhead at Cape Torokaina. What the enemy didn't know was that Marines from the 21st Regiment had anticipated their approach route and prepared a devastating surprise. The thick canopy above muffled the distant sound of artillery as Hawkins glanced at the young Marine beside him, PFC Lloyd Donahue, a 22-year-old from Ohio. The man's hands were trembling slightly as he clutched his rifle. Hawkins gave him a reassuring nod. They'd been ordered to allow the Japanese patrol to pass fully into their ambush position before revealing their presence. An entire company of Japanese infantry was about to walk directly into what the Marines had named the Coconut Grove. No one in the Marine Corps knew that these men's discipline and patience that humid morning would rewrite the battle for Bougainville and save thousands of American lives that the Japanese believed were still clustered on the beach, completely vulnerable to attack. Maxwell Hawkins had grown up in the rural outskirts of Portland, Oregon, the son of a timber worker. His father, James Hawkins, had taught him to hunt from an early age, training his eye to spot deer moving silently through the forest. By his late teens, young Maxwell could track animals across miles of woodland, reading broken twigs and disturbed foliage like words on a page. He'd often disappear into the forests for days at a time, returning home with game for the family table. The Great Depression had hit the Hawkins family hard, like so many others. By 1932, the local timber industry had collapsed, and James Hawkins struggled to find steady work. Maxwell left school to help support the family, taking odd jobs at neighboring farms and occasionally guiding wealthy hunters from Portland through the wilderness areas he knew so intimately. "You've got the eyes of a hawk and the patience of a mountain," an impressed businessman once told him after Maxwell had spotted a 10-point buck nearly half a mile away through dense forest. That patience would serve him well in the Marines. When war broke out in Europe, Maxwell paid little attention at first. The troubles of distant continents seemed far removed from the daily struggle to help his family survive. But after Pearl Harbor, everything changed. Though he could have sought an exemption as his family's primary breadwinner, Maxwell walked into the recruitment office in January 1942. "My country needs men who can shoot and survive in rough conditions," he told his tearful mother the night before he left. "That's me, Mom. I've been training for this my whole life without knowing it." Maxwell's natural woodcraft and marksmanship quickly caught the attention of his instructors at boot camp. Unlike many of the city recruits who struggled with the physical demands and outdoor conditions, Maxwell thrived. His ability to move silently through difficult terrain and spot hidden targets made him a natural scout. By the time he completed training, he'd been promoted to private first class and assigned to the 1st Marine Division. His first taste of combat came at Guadalcanal, where the jungle conditions proved far more challenging than Oregon's temperate forests. The suffocating heat, strange diseases, and ever-present threat of Japanese ambush tested even Maxwell's woodland skills. During one particularly fierce firefight, Maxwell had saved his squad by spotting a hidden Japanese machine gun nest before it could open fire on their position. "How the hell did you see that?" his squad leader had asked afterward. "The birds," Maxwell explained. They were flying away from that spot in an unnatural pattern. Something had disturbed them. That observation earned him a field promotion to corporal and cemented his reputation as having almost supernatural awareness of the environment. After Guadalcanal, he was transferred to the 3rd Marine Division and promoted again to sergeant, tasked with training other Marines in jungle detection and survival techniques. By the time the division prepared for the Bougainville landing, Sergeant Hawkins had become an invaluable asset for reconnaissance operations. His squad was often sent ahead to scout landing areas and establish forward positions. Many credited their survival to his instincts. "Hawkins doesn't just move through the jungle," his platoon leader once remarked. "He becomes part of it. The Japanese never see him coming." But the toll of combat had left its mark. The easy-going Oregon woodsman had been replaced by a harder, more taciturn man. He wrote infrequently to his family, struggling to describe the horrors he had witnessed. How could he tell them about watching his friends die in the muddy jungles of islands they'd never heard of? Instead, his letters focused on mundane details and reassurances of his safety. At night, when sleep evaded him, Maxwell would stare up at unfamiliar stars and think about the Douglas fir forests of home, wondering if he would ever walk among them again. As the Allied campaign in the Pacific gained momentum in mid-1943, strategic attention turned toward isolating the massive Japanese base at Rabaul. This formidable stronghold on New Britain Island posed a significant threat to Allied operations, with its airfields capable of launching attacks throughout the Solomon Islands and New Guinea. Admiral William Bull Halsey, commander of the South Pacific area, recognized that directly assaulting Rabaul would be prohibitively costly in both lives and resources. Instead, he proposed a strategy of progressive isolation, systematically capturing surrounding islands to establish air bases that could neutralize Rabaul through bombing raids and cut off its supply lines. Bougainville, the largest of the Solomon Islands, emerged as a critical objective in this strategy. Lying approximately 220 miles southeast of Rabaul, it would provide an ideal location for airfields to launch bombing missions against the Japanese stronghold. The island stretched nearly 130 miles from northwest to southeast and was dominated by mountainous jungle terrain with active volcanoes, swift-flowing rivers, and dense rainforests that received over 200 inches of rainfall annually. The Japanese had occupied Bougainville since early 1942, constructing multiple airfields and fortifying their positions. By November 1943, approximately 40,000 Japanese troops were stationed on the island, primarily concentrated around these airfields at Buka in the north, and Kahili and Kara in the south. After careful consideration, American planners selected Cape Torokina along the western coast at Empress Augusta Bay as the invasion point. This area was less heavily defended than the main Japanese installations, and its flat terrain would be suitable for rapid airfield construction. The Marines would establish a beachhead, expand their perimeter enough to accommodate bomber airfields, and then hold this position rather than attempting to capture the entire island. On November 1, 1943, the 3rd Marine Division, under the command of Major General Alan Turnage, conducted an amphibious landing at Cape Torokina. Despite challenging surf conditions and swampy terrain beyond the beaches, the Marines established a beachhead by nightfall, having encountered only light resistance from the surprised Japanese defenders. The Japanese High Command, under Lieutenant General Harukichi Hyakutake, initially believed the American landing was merely a diversion, with the main attack expected at either Buka in the north or the southern airfields. This misconception worked to the Americans' advantage, allowing them to solidify their position before facing a concerted counterattack. As the Marines expanded their perimeter, they began pushing inland along jungle trails that might serve as avenues for Japanese counterattacks. The Numa Numa Trail, which ran inland from the coast, was identified as a likely approach route for enemy forces from their main positions in the north and east. It was along this trail that the 21st Marine Regiment would encounter the Japanese 23rd Infantry Regiment in what would become known as the Battle of the Coconut Grove. The dense jungle terrain of Bougainville presented enormous challenges for both sides. The island's climate was brutally hot and humid, with frequent torrential downpours that turned trails into muddy quagmires. Marine veterans later described Bougainville as worse than Guadalcanal for its oppressive conditions. Visibility was often limited to just a few yards, and the thick vegetation provided perfect cover for ambushes by either side. Diseases ran rampant, with malaria, dengue fever, and fungal infections debilitating troops almost as effectively as enemy bullets. Supplying forward positions required exhausting carries through nearly impassable terrain. Even radio communication was hampered by the dense jungle canopy and mountainous topography. It was in this environment that Marine reconnaissance patrols detected Japanese troop movements heading toward their perimeter along the Numa Numa Trail. Intelligence officers determined that elements of the Japanese 23rd Infantry Regiment were preparing to probe American defenses and potentially launch a counterattack against the vulnerable beachhead. Rather than waiting to be attacked, Marine commanders devised a plan to ambush the approaching Japanese forces at a tactically advantageous point along the trail. A critical junction where the Numa Numa Trail intersected with the East-West Trail was selected as the ambush location, as it would allow the Marines to control two major approach routes with a single operation. On November 13th, companies from the 2nd Battalion, 21st Marines moved into position under the command of Lieutenant Colonel Marlowe Williams. Their mission: intercept and destroy the approaching Japanese force before it could threaten the main Marine positions and construction areas for the planned airfields. The stakes were enormous. If the Japanese could penetrate the American perimeter and disrupt airfield construction, the entire Bougainville operation, and by extension the strategy to isolate Rabaul, would be jeopardized. Thousands of American lives and months of strategic planning hung in the balance as Marine units disappeared into the jungle to prepare their deadly welcome. The rising tension in the Coconut Grove grew almost unbearable as minutes stretched into hours. Sergeant Hawkins could feel his muscles cramping from remaining so still, but years of hunting had taught him that movement meant failure. Nearby, radioman Vincent Morelli clutched his SCR-300 backpack radio, maintaining communications with Marine artillery positioned 2 miles back toward the beachhead. At precisely 11:05, the first signs of Japanese movement appeared. Through the dense foliage, Hawkins detected subtle shifts in the pattern of light and shadow along the trail. He squeezed the shoulder of PFC Donahue beside him and held up one finger, then gradually increased to 5, signaling the number of enemy soldiers visible as point elements for what intelligence suggested would be a much larger force. The Japanese point men moved cautiously but confidently, sweeping the trail ahead with practiced eyes. They wore standard Imperial Army uniforms, faded olive drab with wrapped leggings, their faces obscured by cloth tied around their helmets to break up the outline. Each carried an Arisaka Type 99 rifle with fixed bayonet. Behind them came more soldiers, moving in loose formation. Lieutenant Gunderson had positioned his men in an L-shaped ambush formation with the heaviest firepower along the long side of the L, parallel to the trail. Marine bar men were situated to deliver maximum suppressive fire once the ambush was sprung, with rifle squads positioned to prevent escape or flanking attempts. The short leg of the L would prevent Japanese retreat back down the trail. The plan was to allow the main Japanese force to fully enter the kill zone before initiating contact. Hawkins counted silently as more enemy soldiers entered the area, 20, 30, 40, with more still appearing around the bend. The Japanese commander, a lieutenant by his insignia, walked confidently near the middle of the column, occasionally consulting a map. At one point, a Japanese soldier stopped and appeared to look directly toward Hawkins's position. The sergeant remained perfectly still, controlling even his breathing as sweat dripped into his eyes. After what felt like an eternity, the soldier shrugged and continued forward. More Japanese troops continued to file into the area, now numbering at least 75. The signal would be a single shot from Lieutenant Gunderson's position. Every Marine tensed as they waited, fingers moving closer to triggers, eyes fixed on their assigned sectors. The jungle seemed unnaturally quiet, as if the wildlife itself were holding its breath. When the lieutenant's rifle finally cracked, the effect was devastating. Dozens of Marine weapons opened fire simultaneously from concealed positions, catching the Japanese in a murderous crossfire. Bar men swept the trail with automatic fire, while riflemen picked off officers and those attempting to organize a defense. Japanese soldiers fell by the dozen in those first seconds, many never knowing what had hit them. The surviving Japanese troops reacted quickly, dropping to the ground and returning fire toward the Marine positions. But firing blindly into the jungle proved ineffective against well-concealed targets. When several Japanese soldiers attempted to charge the Marine line with bayonets, they were cut down before covering more than a few yards. Sergeant Hawkins sighted and fired methodically, each shot finding its mark. Through his scope, he spotted a Japanese officer attempting to organize a counterattack and squeezed the trigger. The officer crumpled mid-sentence. Within minutes, the trail was littered with fallen Japanese soldiers, the survivors desperately seeking cover in the undergrowth. "Shift fire right. They're trying to flank," Gunderson shouted as a group of Japanese soldiers attempted to work around the Marine position. Hawkins and his squad adjusted their aim, catching the flanking party in enfilading fire that left none standing. The battle intensified as Japanese mortar teams, positioned farther back, began dropping rounds near the Marine positions. Soil and shrapnel erupted around Hawkins as he ducked lower into his foxhole. Nearby, PFC Donahue was struck in the shoulder by fragments. His face contorted in pain as he continued firing his rifle one-handed. "Morelli, call in coordinates for artillery," Hawkins shouted to the radio man. "Danger close, 200 yards east of our position." The radio man relayed the coordinates, and minutes later, American 105 mm howitzer shells screamed overhead, impacting among the Japanese mortar positions. The enemy fire slackened immediately as their support weapons were silenced. For nearly 3 hours, the battle raged through the coconut grove. The initial ambush had been devastatingly effective, but the Japanese fought with characteristic tenacity, refusing to surrender even when clearly outnumbered and outgunned. Small groups of Japanese soldiers attempted to infiltrate between Marine positions, resulting in close quarters fighting with bayonets and entrenching tools when ammunition ran low. By mid-afternoon, the outcome was no longer in doubt. Over 100 Japanese soldiers lay dead along the trail and surrounding jungle. With many more wounded, the survivors had withdrawn eastward, leaving behind weapons, equipment, and documents of significant intelligence value. Marine casualties were significantly lighter, 14 killed and 46 wounded. But each loss weighed heavily on the survivors. As Sergeant Hawkins helped load wounded Marines onto stretchers for evacuation, he spotted Lieutenant Gunderson kneeling beside the body of a Japanese officer, examining documents found in a waterproof case. "What did we get, sir?" Hawkins asked, wiping blood and mud from his face. The lieutenant looked up, his expression grim but satisfied. "Battalion strength reports, patrol schedules, and, most importantly, plans for a major assault on our perimeter scheduled for 3 days from now. Looks like we just disrupted their reconnaissance element." Hawkins nodded, understanding the significance. "So we didn't just win this fight, we prevented a much bigger one." "Exactly, Sergeant," Gunderson replied, carefully placing the documents in a waterproof bag. "Intelligence is going to have a field day with these, and the Japanese are going to have to rethink their entire approach now that they know we control this junction." As daylight faded, Marine reinforcements arrived to secure the area. The survivors of Echo Company were relieved and sent back toward the main perimeter for rest and resupply. Walking back down the trail, Hawkins paused to look back at the coconut grove, now turned into a battlefield by the day's fighting. The dense jungle would soon reclaim the area, covering the evidence of the brutal struggle that had taken place there. What neither he nor any of the other Marines could know then was that the ambush at the coconut grove would prove to be a pivotal moment in the Bougainville campaign. By seizing control of the critical junction between the Numa and east-west trails, they had secured the northern approaches to the Marine perimeter, enabling construction of the vital airfields to proceed without interference. More importantly, the documents captured during the ambush provided invaluable intelligence that allowed Marine commanders to anticipate and counter subsequent Japanese movements. The major attack planned for 3 days later was disrupted before it could be launched, saving countless American lives. The battle was just one engagement in the long and brutal campaign for Bougainville, but it exemplified the courage, tactical skill, and determination that characterized the Marine Corps' jungle fighting in the Pacific Theater. Men like Sergeant Maxwell Hawkins, who brought their civilian skills and adaptability to the battlefield, proved to be the difference between victory and defeat in the dense, unforgiving jungle environment. In the days following the ambush at the Coconut Grove, Japanese forces attempted to reestablish control of the strategic trail junction. Each attack was met with increasingly well-prepared Marine defenses, resulting in heavy Japanese casualties for minimal gains. By November 18th, the Japanese command reluctantly conceded that the junction was firmly in American hands and redirected their efforts elsewhere. The successful defense of the trail junction allowed Marine engineers to accelerate construction of the airfields at Cape Tarokina. The first fighter strip was operational by December 9, 1943, with Marine Corsairs flying combat missions against Japanese positions the following day. Within weeks, Army Air Forces bombers were staging through Bougainville for attacks on Rabaul, effectively beginning the neutralization of that major Japanese base. For Sergeant Maxwell Hawkins, the aftermath of the battle brought both recognition and sorrow. His leadership during the ambush earned him a Bronze Star with V Device for Valor, presented by Major General Alan Turnage himself. But the cost had been high. 3 men from his squad, including his assistant squad leader, Corporal Frank DiMaggio, were among those killed in action. The weeks following the Coconut Grove ambush saw continued fighting as Marines expanded their perimeter and repelled Japanese counterattacks. Battles at Piva Forks, Hellzapoppin Ridge, and Hill 600A tested the Marines' resolve, but ultimately resulted in a secure perimeter encompassing the vital airfield construction zones. By late December 1943, the immediate Japanese threat to the American beachhead had been contained. In a significant shift of strategy, Army units began replacing Marine forces, with the American Division taking over defensive responsibilities on December 28th. The 3rd Marine Division, exhausted by nearly 2 months of continuous combat in appalling conditions, was withdrawn for rest and re-equipping in preparation for future operations. The Japanese, however, refused to accept defeat. They spent the next several months gathering forces and planning a major counteroffensive aimed at driving the Americans from Bougainville. In March 1944, they launched an all-out attack with nearly 15,000 troops against what they believed was a thinly defended American perimeter. What they encountered instead was a well-prepared defense manned by experienced Army units with overwhelming artillery support. The resulting Battle of the Perimeter lasted from March 8th to 25th, ending in a catastrophic Japanese defeat with over 5,000 killed and minimal American losses. With this decisive failure, organized Japanese resistance on Bougainville effectively collapsed. The remaining Japanese forces withdrew into the island's interior, where they would remain isolated and increasingly desperate until the war's end. American and later Australian forces maintained control of the airfields, which continued to play a vital role in neutralizing Rabaul and supporting operations throughout the South Pacific. For the men who had fought at the Coconut Grove, their contribution to the ultimate victory would always be a source of pride. Their skill and courage in the face of a determined enemy had helped secure a vital foothold in the long march toward Japan. The jungle ambush that stopped the Japanese advance cold had proven to be a turning point, not just for the Bougainville campaign, but for the entire Solomon Islands offensive. The strategic significance of the Bougainville operation extended far beyond the immediate tactical victories. By neutralizing Rabaul through air power, rather than costly direct assault, the Allied command had demonstrated a new approach to island warfare in the Pacific, one that would save thousands of American lives in the campaigns to come. The island-hopping strategy pioneered in operations like Bougainville would become the template for the remainder of the Pacific War. Rather than attacking every Japanese stronghold, Allied forces would bypass and isolate many heavily defended positions, leaving their garrisons to wither on the vine while focusing efforts on objectives of greater strategic importance. The successful establishment of airfields on Bougainville represented a critical step in this strategy. From these bases, American aircraft conducted more than 6,000 sorties against Rabaul between December 1943 and February 1944. This aerial bombardment, combined with naval blockades, effectively neutralized Rabaul without requiring a single American soldier to land on its heavily defended shores. By March 1944, the Japanese had withdrawn their aircraft from Rabaul, abandoning plans to use it as a base for continuing operations in the South Pacific. The once formidable bastion had been rendered impotent not through direct assault, but through strategic isolation, a process that began with the Marine landing at Cape Torokina and the crucial battles for control of the jungle trails leading to the beachhead. For Sergeant Maxwell Hawkins and the other veterans of the Coconut Grove ambush, their return to civilian life after the war brought new challenges and opportunities. Hawkins, like many combat veterans, found the transition difficult at first. The skills that had made him an exceptional jungle fighter, hypervigilance, instinctive reactions to sudden movements, split-second decision-making, proved problematic in peaceful surroundings. But the same resourcefulness and adaptability that had served him in combat helped him adjust to civilian life. Using the GI Bill, he completed a forestry degree at Oregon State University and eventually secured a position with the U.S. Forest Service. His intimate understanding of woodland ecosystems, combined with the leadership skills developed during his Marine service, made him particularly effective in wildfire management and conservation efforts. In 1955, Hawkins married Elizabeth Connor, a fellow Forest Service employee, and they established a life together in a small house near Mount Hood. Although he rarely spoke about his wartime experiences, he maintained contact with several members of his old squad, including Lloyd Donahue, who had survived his wounds from the Coconut Grove and become a high school teacher in Cleveland. Each November 13th, Hawkins would take a private hike into the Oregon forests, spending a few quiet hours remembering the men who had fought beside him in that distant jungle ambush. He carried with him a small, worn photograph of Echo Company, taken shortly before the Bougainville landing. Many of the young faces forever frozen in time, never having aged beyond that moment in 1943. In 1973, 30 years after the battle, Hawkins received an unexpected letter from Japan. It was from Toshiro Nakamura, who identified himself as a survivor of the Coconut Grove ambush. Now a professor of history at Kyoto University, Nakamura was researching a book about the Pacific War and sought to correspond with American veterans of the Bougainville campaign. After some hesitation, Hawkins replied, beginning an extraordinary correspondence that continued for over a decade. The two former enemies discovered they shared many similarities: Both had been excellent marksmen who loved the outdoors. Both had struggled with the psychological aftermath of combat, and both had dedicated their post-war lives to constructive pursuits that honored the sacrifices of their fallen comrades. In 1983, at Nakamura's invitation, Hawkins traveled to Japan. The two elderly veterans met in Kyoto, where they spent several days sharing memories and perspectives on the war that had brought them into deadly conflict 4 decades earlier. Their remarkable friendship, forged from the crucible of one of history's most brutal conflicts, stood as testament to the healing power of time and the common humanity that transcends the artificial boundaries of nation and ideology. "We were both just doing our duty as we understood it," Hawkins later wrote in his journal. "The tragedy is that duty required us to try to kill each other. The miracle is that we both survived to find reconciliation." Maxwell Hawkins passed away peacefully in 1992 at the age of 71. Among his personal effects was found a simple wooden box containing his bronze star, the faded photograph of Echo Company, and the letters from Toshiro Nakamura. Also in the box was a small piece of coral from Bougainville, a tangible reminder of the distant jungle island where young men from 2 nations had fought and died in one of history's most consequential conflicts. Today, few Americans remember the battle for Bougainville or the crucial ambush at the Coconut Grove. The jungle has long since reclaimed the site of the fighting, erasing the physical evidence of the struggle that took place there. But the strategic consequences of those events, the neutralization of Rabaul, the refinement of island-hopping tactics, and the thousands of American lives saved by avoiding a direct assault on heavily fortified Japanese positions, continue to influence military thinking and shape our understanding of the Pacific War. The courage and sacrifice of the Marines who laid that ambush in the steaming jungle underscores an essential truth about warfare. Sometimes the most decisive victories are won not through overwhelming force, but through superior positioning, tactical surprise, and the initiative of individual soldiers making critical decisions under the most challenging conditions imaginable. As Sergeant Hawkins understood on that fateful November day in 1943, control of a single jungle crossroads could determine the fate of an entire campaign. The Marines who ambushed the Japanese column at the Coconut Grove may not have realized the full significance of their actions at the time, but their victory helped secure a foothold that would ultimately contribute to the Allied triumph in the Pacific. The story of the Coconut Grove ambush reminds us that history often turns on such seemingly small moments when determined individuals, properly positioned and prepared, seize the initiative and change the course of events through courage, skill, and sacrifice. Their legacy lives on not just in military histories, but in the freedom and peace secured for future generations through their actions in distant jungles long ago. Would you have waited in that steaming jungle, discipline maintaining your silence as the enemy approached? Would you have had the courage to spring the ambush when the moment came, knowing the fury that would follow? Comment below and share this story so others remember what courage really means.